This episode 2026, Iran conflict and the fight for a new world order from the Sovereign Drift series, is brought to you by Viscard Studio.
We are stepping into an exploration of what analysts are calling one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of this decade.
The February 2026 military escalation.
Involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. Now you, the listener, you have likely seen the headlines flashing across your screen. You've watched the global markets react with extreme volatility, and you've probably felt the anxiety rippling through the international community.
A systemic shock.
A massive shock.
We were talking about the potential restructuring of global infrastructure, a total rewrite of regional diplomacy, and macroeconomic shifts that could impact everything.
From the price of gas to the dominance of the U.S. dollar itself.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to unpack all of that. We are going to map out the historical context that supposedly led to this moment.
Trace the timeline.
Right. Trace the timeline of the recent military actions, break down the ripple effects on global economics, and examine some of the really fascinating who benefits theories circulating among geopolitical analysts right now.
The strategic realpolitik angles.
Yeah. But before we get into the weeds, we have to establish the ground rules for you. This is non-negotiable for how we operate.
It's the core of what we do.
In this deep dive, nothing is presented as absolute truth.
Not a single thing.
Right. Every piece of data, whether it's a historical timeline, a military casualty claim, or an economic forecast, is going to be explored strictly as a perspective.
Or a finding.
Yeah, a finding originating from specific authorities and source materials. We are here to act as your guides through a very dense landscape of different viewpoints.
We aren't here to validate them.
We aren't here to debunk them.
And we certainly aren't taking sides.
If a military brief claims a target was destroyed, we discuss it as a claim from that specific military.
And if an economic paper states a policy failed, we look at it as the thesis of that specific paper.
This epistemological neutrality is an essential framework, especially when dealing with a topic this volatile.
The narratives conflict heavily depending on which source you were reading.
So our job is to synthesize these complex, often contradictory claims so you can see the whole board.
For the listener, just imagine the backdrop for today's discussion slowly transitioning from dusty historical maps of the 1970s to the glowing, real-time global financial tickers of today.
That is the trajectory we are tracking.
Exactly.
So let's start with the immediate catalyst. We have to look at the massive discrepancy in how our sources portray the events of February 2026 compared to what happened just a year earlier in June 2025.
Right, the 12-day war precedent.
Let's look at the most recent claims first. According to reports released by U.S. Central Command, or CNTCOM, and the Israel Defense Forces, a highly coordinated military operation commenced in the early hours of February 28th, 2026.
The documentation from U.S. authorities refers to their component as Operation Epic Fury.
And Israeli military sources outline a campaign they call Operation Rising Lion. The data presented in these military briefings is, frankly, staggering.
The scale is immense.
The IDF claims to have struck over 400 targets across Iran. And when you combine the claims from both U.S. and Israeli forces, the reports detail roughly 900 distinct strikes.
The scale documented in these briefings is unprecedented in the history of direct confrontation between these specific nations.
900 strikes.
Yeah, and if we dig into the specific composition of the arsenals cited in these reports, specifically documentation from Reuters and the Institute for the Study of War, it paints a very specific tactical picture.
What kind of picture?
Well, the claims detail the utilization of Tomahawk cruise missiles, F-18 and F-35 fighter jets, and a massive deployment of single-use drones.
Stop right there for a second, because we hear those names thrown around in movies and news clips constantly.
Sure.
For someone who doesn't read defense blogs every day, what is the significance of that specific combination of weapons? Why does the Institute for the Study of War highlight those?
It comes down to how military analysts describe layering an attack against a heavily defended airspace. Right. According to defense literature, Iran possesses a complex, multi-layered air defense network. The F-35s are highlighted in these reports because they are fifth-generation stealth fighters.
So they can't be seen on radar easily.
Exactly. Their documented purpose is to penetrate contested airspace undetected to take out radar and anti-aircraft batteries. Yeah. And then the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are typically launched from naval vessels hundreds of miles away, are described as low-flying precision munitions.
Used for what?
The sources claim they are used to overwhelm remaining defenses and strike fixed infrastructure.
And the drones.
The single-use drones, often referred to as loitering munitions in the literature, are claimed to be used to swarm targets. This creates confusion and depletes the adversary's defensive interceptors.
So when defense analysts look at this list, they aren't just seeing a random list of weapons.
No, they are observing a claim of a highly choreographed, systemic dismantling of a nation's defensive capabilities.
And the casualty claims coming out of the region really reflect that level of systemic targeting.
They do.
If we pivot to Iranian state media reports, specifically dispatches that have been cited and translated by Reuters and the Times of Israel, the claims are monumental.
Historic, really.
They state that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in these strikes.
Which is a massive claim.
Furthermore, the same Iranian state sources report the deaths of Defense Minister Amir Nasirzadeh, Revolutionary Guards Commander Mohammad Pakpour, and several other high-ranking military officials.
The entire upper echelon.
There are even claims circulating in Iranian state media that members of Khamenei's immediate family were killed.
Now, when we look at the stated objectives behind this operation, the sources present a very sharp contrast.
Right, the why.
U.S. officials are quoted in various transcripts stating their explicit goals were regime change and the total degradation of Iran's nuclear and military capabilities.
They argue this was a necessary preemptive response to an imminent threat.
Conversely, the retaliatory claims and diplomatic statements from Iran present a vastly different narrative.
A completely different picture.
Iranian authorities, speaking through their state broadcasting channels and addressing the UN Security Council, vehemently argue they pose no imminent threat.
They characterize the U.S. and Israeli actions not as preemptive defense, but as unlawful, unprovoked aggression.
And according to reporting by Axios on the Washington Post, Iran claims their response was immediate.
They report launching retaliatory waves of ballistic missiles and drones.
But notably, the targets claimed in these reports weren't just in Israel.
No, this is where it expands.
Iranian state media detail specific strikes against U.S. military installations across the Gulf.
They claim to have hit the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain,
The Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait,
the Al Daid Air Base in Kuwait,
and the Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates.
which instantly drags several supposedly neutral or at least non-combatant nations directly into the crossfire.
Absolutely.
But to really grasp the sheer magnitude of these February 2026 claims, the sources suggest we have to look backward.
We need to examine what policy briefs from the European Council on Foreign Relations and the Congressional Research Service refer to as the 12-Day War of June 2025.
That historical precedent is vital here.
It is. If we look at the analysis outlined in those policy briefs, June 2025 is presented as the moment a long-standing geopolitical taboo was fundamentally broken.
How so?
According to the European Council on Foreign Relations, this was the first instance of Israel launching large-scale preemptive strikes directly inside sovereign Iranian territory.
And the U.S. was involved then too, right?
Yes. Concurrently, the Congressional Research Service documentation notes that the United States carried out highly specialized strikes against 3 key Iranian nuclear sites.
The U.S. military reportedly utilized B-2 Spirit bombers, dropping specialized GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons.
Also known in the defense community as bunker busters.
Let's unpack that, because one of the primary targets mentioned in these reports is the Fordo nuclear facility.
Right.
From what I understand reading these geography briefings, Fordo isn't just a building sitting in a field.
No, it's built deep inside a mountain.
So how did the military sources claim a conventional bomber actually destroys a facility buried under solid rock?
That is the exact technical challenge highlighted in the defense literature.
Okay.
According to specifications detailed in military technology journals, the GBU-57 is a 30,000-pound precision-guided bomb.
30,000 pounds.
Yeah. And it doesn't explode on impact.
It doesn't.
No. The claim is that it uses its massive kinetic energy, a hardened steel casing, and a delayed fuse to burrow through dozens of meters of earth and reinforced concrete before detonating.
Wow.
The Institute for Science and International Security actually published a battle damage assessment back in 2025, analyzing commercial satellite imagery of the aftermath.
And what did they find?
Their analysts claimed that those 2025 strikes effectively destroyed Iran's centrifuge enrichment program at sites like Natanz and Esfahan and severely compromised Fordo.
Setting back their nuclear capability significantly.
That's the claim.
But if they supposedly destroyed the centrifuge programs in June 2025, why are the military briefings in February 2026 claiming they need to strike again to achieve total degradation?
Well, the outcomes of these two conflicts are portrayed very differently in the think tank literature.
They're a different paradigm.
Entirely different. The analyses we have suggest that the June 2025 conflict ended in a fragile, informal pause.
A pause.
The European Council on Foreign Relations described the 2025 aftermath as an environment where Iranian leadership remained fully intact.
Projecting confidence through state media.
Right, and claiming they had successfully forced Israel to halt its strikes. It is framed in these documents as a highly kinetic containment strategy.
Just containment.
Yes. The military and political reports characterizing the February 2026 operations, however, suggest maximalist approach.
The stated U.S. goal, as reported by outlets covering White House statements, is no longer just degrading nuclear facilities to enforce a pause.
The explicitly stated goals are now unconditional surrender and systemic regime change.
So we have military and political authorities from the U.S. and Israel claiming that overwhelming preemptive strikes are a necessary mechanism to neutralize an existential threat and enforce regional security.
Right.
Conversely, we have international bodies like the UN Security Council, alongside Iranian state authorities, arguing that these exact actions constitute unlawful aggression that actively provokes regional instability and betrays the framework of international law.
Which leaves us with a very significant tension.
It does. When the doctrine of preemptive security conflicts with the framework of sovereign defense and international law, which paradigm ultimately dictates global order, that is something for you, the listener, to weigh.
It is a fundamental tension that underpins everything we are discussing today.
And it perfectly transitions us into looking at the deeply entrenched narratives these nations hold.
Because the military actions detailed in these reports do not happen in a vacuum.
No, they don't. To understand why these states are acting the way the documents claim they're acting, we have to examine the ideological and historical drivers highlighted in our source stack.
Let's trace the timeline back, as several of our historical documents do, to the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
According to an extensive analysis published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, 1979 is framed as the pivotal year Iran transformed into an Islamic republic.
A transition built on actively rejecting what it perceived as American imperial influence and Western hegemony in the region.
This historical shift is heavily documented in the ideological claims translated from Iranian leadership over the decades.
We have a source text titled The New Iranian Leadership, which provides direct translations of speeches and state doctrine.
What is really striking about these translated documents is how they frame the conflict.
It is not presented merely in terms of political borders or resource allocation.
Right, it's framed in existential and religious terms.
According to these translations, Iranian leaders have consistently characterized the Islamic Ummah, which refers to the global Islamic community.
Right.
They characterize it as being fundamentally and irrevocably opposed to Israel's presence in the Middle East.
The text cites previous speeches where Iranian officials explicitly referred to Israel as a historic enemy implanted in the heartland of the Islamic world.
With some translated quotes claiming that the Zionist regime will soon be wiped out.
The rhetoric presented in those translated sources is absolute. It leaves very little room for traditional diplomatic compromise.
But then we flip the perspective and look at the Israeli national security documents and analyses, such as those detailed in Foreign Affairs magazine.
And these sources characterize Iran, and specifically its network of proxy militias, in equally existential terms.
The Israeli security documents refer to this network Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and various allied factions in Iraq and Syria.
They refer to them as an active ring of fire.
A ring of fire, exactly. According to this analytical perspective, Iran's overarching geopolitical strategy has been to slowly encircle and ultimately destroy the Israeli state through a war of attrition.
The Foreign Affairs piece notes that for Israeli leadership, combating this perceived Iranian threat has been the defining foreign policy commitment.
Across multiple, otherwise ideologically opposed, Israeli governments.
Which brings us to a concept policy analysts refer to as the deterrence equation.
For decades, the dominant strategy employed by the U.S. and Israel, as described by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, was one of imperial containment.
The documentation outlines this as a hybrid campaign.
It wasn't direct war.
No, but it involved heavy economic sanctions designed to cripple the Iranian economy.
Covert actions including reported cyber attacks like Stuxnet, And the targeted assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists?
And complex diplomatic maneuvers. The most prominent of these was the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, nuclear deal.
Which the U.S. subsequently withdrew from in 2018.
But according to the findings in these think tank reports, that strategy of containment didn't achieve its stated goals.
No. The Arab Center report claims that instead of collapsing the Iranian system or forcing them to abandon their regional ambitions, decades of immense economic and covert pressure actually hardened the state's resilience.
The analysis claims this pressure forced Iran to innovate, expanding its proxy network across the region and solidifying its defensive posture.
The thesis here is that containment exposed the limits of American influence in the Middle East,
leading directly to the breakdown of deterrence that we see reported in the massive escalations of 2025 and 2026.
And we really must consider the regional perspective here.
Because they are the ones caught in the middle of this deterrence breakdown.
Specifically, the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC states.
Which includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman.
According to a brief by Al Jazeera Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, the leadership in these states is reportedly terrified by the current escalation.
Terrified. The analysis claims that for years, these states have played a very delicate double game.
They relied heavily on a U.S. security umbrella,
hosting massive American military bases and purchasing Western defense systems,
while simultaneously trying to build diplomatic bridges and economic ties with Tehran to ensure regional stability.
I want to paint a picture of why that vulnerability is so acute for these GCC states.
It's crucial context.
If you look at cities like Dubai in the UAE or Doha in Qatar, they have spent decades building these shiny, futuristic, hyper-modern economies.
Economies that are almost entirely dependent on foreign investment.
International tourism.
And the perception of total stability.
The Al Jazeera analysis suggests that because U.S. forces reportedly launched operations from bases within these GCC countries in 2026, Iran is now retaliating against those specific territories.
And a single stray missile hitting a financial district or an airport doesn't just damage a building.
It shatters the illusion of safety that their entire economic model relies upon.
The sources claim these Gulf states are watching with absolute dread as the deterrence equation shatters,
leaving them caught squarely in the crossfire of a massive regional war they spent years actively trying to prevent.
This complex web of historical grievances and security strategies presents a profound contradiction in our source material.
It really does.
We have historical and political analyses suggesting that state behavior in this region is driven by a calculated, realpolitik deterrence equation.
Meaning actions are taken based on tangible security threats, economic pressures, and the physical balance of military power.
Conversely, we have documented ideological and religious statements from leadership framing the conflict as a non-negotiable existential mandate rooted deeply in theology and historical identity.
This raises a vital question.
When analyzing international conflicts, do we prioritize the tangible metrics of geopolitical strategy or the deeply rooted societal and ideological narratives that leaders publicly claim to follow?
The listener must consider how these two forces interact.
That is a massive framework to keep in mind.
So we have this ideological breakdown. Missiles are reportedly flying across the region, and military bases are on high alert.
But the immediate fallout of a conflict like this isn't just measured in craters or military casualties.
It's measured in dollars and cents.
Let's look at what happened to the global markets the second those strikes were announced.
According to live market updates and financial reports from agencies like AFP and crypto analysts at Moodrex, the moment the February 2026 strikes hit the newswires, global energy markets went into an absolute frenzy.
The international benchmark, Brent crude, reportedly jumped to $92.69 per barrel.
The reports note that is a 30% weekly increase.
30% in a week.
Meanwhile, the U.S. West Texas Intermediate, or WTI contract, soared over 12%.
Before we move past those numbers, it's worth clarifying what the financial literature means when it cites these benchmarks.
Good idea.
Brent crude and WTI are essentially the two primary flavors or pricing standards for the world's oil.
WTI is the American standard, extracted primarily in the U.S.,
while Brent is the international standard, originally pulled from the North Sea.
Because Brent crude prices dictate the cost of roughly 2/3 of the world's internationally traded oil supplies, when financial reports indicate Brent spikes 30% in a week, they are describing global market panic.
And The driver of this panic, according to the financial analyses we are reviewing, isn't just the fact that bombs are dropping.
No, it's about a very specific piece of geography.
The Strait of Hormuz.
For you listening, if you picture the Persian Gulf as a giant bottle of oil, the Strait of Hormuz is the incredibly narrow neck of that bottle.
Reports state that roughly 20% of the world's total petroleum liquids flow through this one tiny waterway.
An analysis from the Foreign Policy Research Institute claims that following the strikes, Iran effectively shut down the strait due to the extreme risk of military crossfire.
The logistical nightmare described in these reports is staggering.
The FPRI document states that over 150 oil and liquefied natural gas, or LNG, tankers were left stranded in the Gulf.
Just picture that. 150 massive vessels carrying the energy lifeblood of the global economy, essentially parked in a combat zone.
The reports indicate this severely disrupted energy flows to major Asian importers,
Specifically citing China, India, and Japan.
whose economies rely heavily on that uninterrupted flow.
When energy markets panic to that degree, the entire global financial system feels the tremor.
We have perspectives from traditional financial strategy groups like Invesco, alongside crypto market analysts like Moodrex, explaining this phenomena.
The term they use across the board is a massive risk-off market sentiment.
The reports detail investors terrified of global inflation surging due to restricted oil supplies.
Historically, and according to these reports presently, during times of acute geopolitical crisis, investors pull their money out of volatile assets and flee to what they perceive as safety.
And what did these financial authorities claim is the ultimate safe haven in 2026?
The US dollar.
The reports indicate a traditional rapid strengthening of the US dollar as global capital seeks security.
The perspective on alternative assets, specifically the cryptocurrency market, during these shocks is deeply analyzed in the Moodrex reports.
There's been a long-standing theory among opponents that decentralized digital currencies, like Bitcoin or various stablecoins, offer a hedge against traditional market instability and state-controlled fiat currencies.
However, the dominant trend reported in the immediate aftermath of the 2026 conflict was a pronounced flight to the liquidity and perceived stability of the US dollar.
The analysts suggest that in the very short term, the extreme volatility of the conflict actually amplified the volatility of alternative assets,
When investors face a sudden massive liquidity crunch, they tend to liquidate everything
including crypto.
to hold cash.
But the crypto analysts also present a longer-term theory, right?
They do. The Moodrex analysis suggests that while the short-term impact is a flight to the dollar, a protracted conflict that weaponizes traditional banking systems and disrupts global trade routes could accelerate cryptocurrency and stablecoin adoption in the long run.
The thesis is that if nations find their traditional financial networks severed by sanctions or conflict, the utility of borderless, decentralized finance becomes a matter of national economic survival.
Not just speculative investment.
But again, that is framed as a long-term theoretical outcome versus the immediate documented flight to the US dollar.
Right. Now, here's where the economic analysis takes a fascinating, almost Machiavellian turn.
We are looking at chaos in the energy markets. But a special report from The Telegraph introduces a perspective they call strategic realpolitik.
This is the classic who benefits theory.
According to the geopolitical analysts cited in this report, this massive disruption in the Middle East might actually serve broader long-term Western strategic objectives.
The argument here is that this isn't just uncontrollable chaos.
It is a calculated opportunity to reshape global trade.
The most prominent example of this theory in our source material is what the Telegraph refers to as the Venezuela pivot.
To understand the mechanics of this claim, we have to look at the broader geopolitical map again.
The report claims that earlier in the year, the U.S. conducted a military operation in Venezuela.
Now, with the Middle East energy supply facing a massive vacuum due to the Strait of Hormuz closure, the theory posits that the U.S. has a strategic opening
to rapidly reintegrate the Venezuelan oil sector into the global market under Western influence.
Let's break down how that actually works economically, because it's a masterclass in the theory of energy substitution.
The claim is that the sky-high global oil prices caused by the Middle East crisis provide an interim Venezuelan government with a massive financial incentive to accept U.S. security guarantees and corporate presence.
They need money, the world needs oil, and the U.S. controls the sanctions.
The Telegraph's analysis suggests this dynamic allows the United States to nearshore its energy supplies,
bringing a massive oil reserve back into its hemisphere of influence.
More importantly, by controlling this new flow of Venezuelan oil, The U.S. could theoretically offset the roughly 1.6 million barrels per day that Iran typically exports.
And who does that hurt the most?
The Congressional Research Service reports claim that China purchases roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports.
If this Venezuela pivot theory holds true, it frames the military action in the Middle East not just as a regional security measure, but as a global lever to manipulate economic power dynamics.
By lifting sanctions on one adversary, Venezuela, to crush another, Iran, the U.S. theoretically secures its own energy supply while simultaneously starving a primary global competitor of theirs.
But the financial sources also offer severe historical cautionary tales about trying to play this kind of geopolitical chess with global energy.
Invesco's strategy document compares the potential market reactions of the 2026 crisis to historical supply shocks.
They point to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where restricted oil supplies triggered severe global inflation, gas lines, and widespread market crashes.
Conversely, they note the 2003 Iraq War, where despite the massive conflict, oil supplies were largely uninterrupted because global production shifted.
Specifically noting that U.S. domestic production increased significantly during that era to offset the disruption.
The economic authorities are essentially warning that energy choke points are incredibly dangerous and entirely unpredictable.
So we have financial and geopolitical analysts proposing that global conflicts can be strategically leveraged to reshape global trade to a nation's advantage.
Like the alleged Venezuela pivot.
On the other hand, historical economic data warns that energy choke points can trigger unpredictable global inflation and systemic market failure that bypasses any single nation's control.
This leaves us with a profound tension.
Are global markets truly subject to strategic controlled chaos by superpowers, or do these military actions unleash economic forces that no single nation can manage? That is for the listener to decide.
It really makes you rethink every headline you read about fluctuations in gas prices. The ripple effects are astronomical.
And speaking of global ripple effects, we need to look at how the other heavyweights in the international stage are reportedly reacting.
We've talked deeply about the U.S., Israel, Iran, and the Gulf states. But what about Russia and China?
According to intelligence claims reported by the Washington Post, Russia is absolutely not sitting on the sidelines of this escalation.
The report cites anonymous intelligence officials claiming that Moscow is actively providing Iran with advanced targeting intelligence against U.S. forces.
Specifically including the real-time locations of warships and aircraft in the region.
That is a critical claim to isolate. If the intelligence reported by the Post is accurate, it marks the direct, active involvement of a nuclear-armed global competitor actively assisting Iran in targeting American military assets.
And if we look at the economic analysis provided by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, this aligns with Russia's broader strategic goals.
The FPRI notes that benchmark oil prices for Russia's specific Urals blend surged well above their budgetary assumptions due to the Middle East conflict.
The analysis claims this provided Moscow with an unexpected and massive financial windfall, which is crucial for them amidst their own ongoing geopolitical struggles and sanctions.
Russia, according to these analyses, benefits economically from the Middle East instability while simultaneously bogging down U.S. military and financial resources in another theater.
And then there is China's position in all of this.
As we mentioned, the Congressional Research Service reports indicate that Iranian oil accounts for about 14% of China's total oil imports.
The documents indicate that Beijing is watching its vital energy supply chain face severe, perhaps catastrophic, disruption.
Furthermore, international news dispatches claim that China has actively urged its citizens to evacuate Iran,
signaling their internal assessment of the extreme danger and long-term instability in the region. They aren't treating this as a passing skirmish.
Meanwhile, the perspective of the Gulf Arab states, as outlined in the European Council on Foreign Relations brief, is one of profound vulnerability and the failure of strategic hedging.
As we discussed earlier, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have reportedly spent years trying to build diplomatic bridges with Tehran to avoid exactly this scenario.
Yet, despite their massive financial efforts to remain neutral and protect their economic hubs, their territories, which host significant U.S. military bases, are reportedly being used as launch pads for U.S. strikes.
Consequently, they're being targeted by Iranian retaliatory missiles.
The analysis suggests their attempts to play both sides for the sake of stability appear to have failed to shield them from the fallout.
So looking at all these massively complex moving pieces,
The military strikes,
the ideological drivers,
the economic shockwaves,
and the global power plays, The sources present a few different trajectories for how this ends.
Let's synthesize the scenarios they propose for the short and long-term impact on the global economy and regional stability.
From the perspective of some U.S. and Israeli officials, as documented in various policy briefs, there is a clear best-case scenario.
They argue that the overwhelming degradation of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its ballistic missile capabilities, and its regional proxy networks will lead to a permanently neutralized threat.
The claim is that this immense military and economic pressure will ultimately force a regime collapse in Tehran from within,
paving the way for regional normalization and a U.S.-dominated energy and security realignment in the Middle East.
However, the worst-case perspective, heavily argued by regional analysts, UN officials, and European think tanks, paints a drastically different and much darker picture.
They claim that the conflict is highly likely to spiral into a protracted war of attrition.
According to this view, such a war would permanently cripple global energy markets, driving inflation to unsustainable levels worldwide.
The analysis suggests this would force the United States into a draining, multi-front conflict that degrades its military readiness globally.
And ultimately solidifies a powerful, formalized anti-Western alliance between Iran, Russia, and China.
When historians and policy experts extract lessons from these texts, the primary takeaway they offer for politicians, business leaders, and the general public is the extreme fragility of our modern, interconnected world.
The sources consistently suggest that the global supply chain is incredibly vulnerable to localized shocks.
Furthermore, the historical texts argue that military intervention, regardless of how technologically advanced the weaponry is, has severe limitations when trying to solve deeply entrenched ideological and regional disputes.
The consequences, the documents claim, almost always spill over borders in ways the architects of the conflict never anticipated.
Which brings us to our final synthesis of perspectives.
We are presented with a Western strategic perspective that views overwhelming military force as a necessary, effective tool to dismantle rogue threats, enforce deterrence, and stabilize a volatile region.
Conversely, international diplomats and regional analysts claim that such force only acts as a dangerous catalyst,
inevitably drawing in global rivals like Russia and China and guaranteeing long-term systemic instability.
The unresolved question is this: can immense military superiority actually dictate regional order? Or does the modern, interconnected world guarantee that every localized strike results in an uncontrollable, globalized crisis?
We invite you to evaluate these conflicting realities.
It's a lot to process.
And that is a wrap on today's massive deep dive. I want to thank you, the listener, for navigating this incredibly dense labyrinth of military intelligence, economic data, and historical analysis with us.
We've covered a staggering amount of ground today.
We started by comparing the reported mechanics of the military strikes on facilities like Natanz and Fordo, looking closely at the claims surrounding Operation Epic Fury and Operation Rising Lion.
We traced the ideological roots of the conflict back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, contrasting the translated narrative of the Islamic Ummah against the Israeli security perspective of the proxy ring of fire.
We watched the price of Brent crude skyrocket, explored the flight of the U.S. dollar, and mapped out the geopolitical chess match involving the alleged Venezuela pivot, Russian intelligence sharing, and China's energy vulnerabilities.
It is a vast, complex web of cause and effect, where a decision made in a war room in Washington or Tel Aviv instantly echoes in the oil markets of London, the intelligence hubs of Moscow, and the port cities of the Persian Gulf.
Exactly. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final, lingering concept to explore on your own.
Something to keep turning over.
It builds on the profound vulnerabilities we've discussed today. If a conflict localized to a single physical strait in the Middle East can instantaneously reshape global energy markets, threaten international currencies, and draw the intelligence apparatus of every major superpower into a single arena.
What happens next?
What happens when the next major geopolitical conflict targets not physical shipping lanes, but the digital and satellite infrastructure that makes modern economies function at all?
It's something to think about.
Until next time, we are committed to cutting through the noise, synthesizing the sources, and delivering the ultimate deep dive customized just for you. Thanks for listening.